Greetings, everyone. It's so wonderful to see so many people out tonight, and we welcome you all for coming. My name is Harriet Sugarman, and I am a commissioner on the Environmental Commission, where I have served for 6 years, 5 of those years as chair of the commission. I'm an economist, and I work on climate change education and policy. I've worked for 20 years in this field. I chair and run Climate Mama, and I'm a climate educator with the Climate Reality Project. I also teach global climate change policy at Briana College. So I am thrilled and honored to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Briana Pobiner, who is a paleoanthropologist and an educator, and one of the main organizers and coordinators of the traveling Smithsonian exhibit, Exploring Human Origins, What Does It Mean to Be Human? Also in the back we have Dr. Connie Birdcutt and Dr. Jim Miller, who are also with the Smithsonian. They're waiting back there. And perhaps in the end, you'll also have an opportunity to talk to them, and maybe they'll be answering questions as well. So over 2 years, this exhibit has been and will continue, I think, for another till the end of the summer, April. It's been traveling to 19 libraries around the country. Wyckoff is the only library in New Jersey and in the entire tri-state area to host this exhibit. So I know that I speak for all of us in expressing our pride and our honor as we celebrate and acknowledge this special opportunity. So given this fact, before I introduce Dr. Pobiner, I'd like to thank some of the many people and organizations that have been instrumental in helping us secure this prestigious, thought-provoking, and exciting exhibit. So first and foremost, the staff of the Wyckoff Public Library, and in particular, Laura Leonard, who is our library director, as well as Mary Witherall, our former library director, who initiated the exhibit application process. So without both of them and the help of Brian Scanlon on our township committee, is traveling and unable to be here for this opening event, but you will see him at other events over the next month. Next, and of course, I'd like to thank our entire Township Committee, the Wyckoff Library Board of Trustees, the administrative staff and teachers at our Wyckoff Public Library, at our Wyckoff Public Schools, the Wyckoff Environmental Commission, Chris Pedersen at Cedar Hill Church, and last but certainly not least, the Wyckoff Family YMCA. Dr. Briana Pobiner has a BA in Evolutionary Study from Bryn Mawr College and a master's and a PhD in Anthropology from Rutgers University. Briana's research centers on the evolution of the human diet with a focus on meat eating, but has included topics as diverse as cannibalism in the Cook Islands and chimpanzee carnivory. She has done fieldwork in Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa, and Indonesia, and has been supported in her research by a wide range of competitive and prestigious programs, including the Fulbright Hays Program, the Leakey Foundation, the National Geographic Society, the National Science Foundation, Rutgers University, the Society for American Archaeology, and the Smithsonian Institution, to name a few. Dr. Pobiner is an associate research professor of anthropology at the George Washington University, and in 2005, she joined the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. to help put together the Hall of Human Origins. So in addition to continuing her active field, laboratory, and experimental research program, she also leads the Human Origins program education and outreach efforts, and she manages the public programs, the website content, social media, and exhibition volunteer training for this traveling program. Since the Hall of Human Origins opened its doors just 5 years ago, more than 20 million people have visited. So it would seem that Briana is pretty good at her job. Humanity's impact on the Earth is now so profound that many scientists believe that we've entered a new geological epoch. the Anthropocene. That literally means the age of humankind, acknowledging humans' dominance over the earth. While the exact start of this designation continues to be debated and discussed in the halls of science, it would seem that this exhibit creates an opportunity in the halls of our library for us to contemplate and discuss our role, our place, and our influence on the world. In reading about this traveling exhibit, I kept coming across variations of the following quote. So to paraphrase, it says, "We hope that this exhibit will spark a respectful and a positive conversation across the country about what it means to be human. Respectfully and positive conversation between people of differing points of view has never been more important than it is now." Thank you to all of the people involved in bringing this wonderful exhibit to us. And without further ado, I turn things over to you, Dr. Pobiner. Thank you. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. I'm not going to reboot and do that. So thank you for having me. You will notice that I am not Rick Potts, who was originally scheduled to give this talk. He's a little bit taller than me. So unfortunately, he's had some health issues and is not able to travel down with us. He is hoping he may be able to join us for the community conversation program on Thursday evening. So we encourage you to join us for that. That will be a more interactive conversational program, and the discussion will be led by Connie Burkett and Jim Miller, who's now laughing in the back of the room. So I will get started, and I hope I do justice to the talk that Rick was planning to give. So I will start by saying thank you, Wyckoff. You, the library team, put together an amazing application and really just knocked it out of the park, and we were thrilled to be able to come. So I'm really happy to be here. Also, just happy to be back in New Jersey, where I had spent quite a bit of time going to graduate school. And I didn't hit any traffic on the Parkway or the Turnpike today. So thank you. It was amazing. Okay. So as was mentioned, we are here because the Exploring Human Origins, What Does It Mean to Be Human traveling exhibit is going to 19 libraries across the U.S. This is stop number 13 over the course of 2 years. And in all of these places, we are doing public programs, so tonight's program as well as Thursday night's community conversation. We're doing a workshop for teachers on Thursday morning. And tomorrow we're having a private touring discussion with clergy. So those are the main programs that the Smithsonian team is coming to do at the libraries. And the libraries, as you can see, are putting on an amazing suite of programs on their own, and I actually wish I could stay for several of them. We're also doing a rigorous evaluation of the project, and so the surveys that you have, part of the funding for the project from the John Templeton Foundation requires an external evaluation to see if we're meeting our goals. So we hope that we are. This gives you a sense of where the traveling exhibit is going. We started off going south from Washington, D.C., then we went all the way across to the West Coast, and now we're back on the East Coast. So the last couple of stops will be New York and Connecticut and Vermont and Maine. I don't know who thought Vermont in February would be a good idea for travel. It'll be great for skiing if we make it there. Hold on, that way. So the subtitle of the exhibit is What Does It Mean to Be Human? And I want you to think about that question because I'm actually going to be asking for some answers from the audience in a couple of minutes. But the exhibit focuses on scientific discoveries, things about fossils and archaeological artifacts that are unearthed in many parts of the world, studies of DNA, understandings of living organisms that are our relatives. But this question, what does it mean to be human, is informed by more than just scientific findings. It's informed by lots of different ways of understanding the world. It's informed by philosophy, it's informed by the books that we read, which you have lots of in this library. It's informed by the arts in general, the values and ethics and principles that we learn.
And it's informed by our everyday experiences growing up. So the subject of human origins in this context can be one of the most exciting but also challenging subjects to think about in a scientific context that really goes beyond science. And for some people, it can be quite a troubling topic to think about. But the goal of our tour around the country is really to nurture, with your help, an open and civil conversation about this very profound and challenging topic. We're hoping that not only maybe will you share a couple of your thoughts with me about the answer, what does it mean to be human, but right inside the exhibit, on the back side of the first panel, there's a place that you can actually put sticky notes with your answer. So if you have a flash of brilliance right after you walk out the door today about what it means to be human, you're welcome to put a sticky note up there. We are collecting all of the sticky notes from all of the libraries, and our website will have a page from each library with all of the answers to the question, what does it mean to be human? So I guess try to be concise, maybe I would say that. Says my volunteer who's typing in all of the answers. So I would love to know anybody's thought on the answer to the question, what does it mean to be human? Does anyone want to share what they think? There's no wrong answer. Yes, ma'am.
The first thought that came to me would be that we have a soul.
We have a soul. That's a wonderful answer and one that we hear fairly frequently. Anybody else?
Contemplate.
Contemplate, to contemplate, absolutely. What we're doing right now in some sense. Back there, yes?
Rational thinking.
Rational thinking, absolutely. And so that's one thing that often is seen to separate humans from all other animals and all other forms of life on Earth in some ways. In some sense, to be able to override instinct. So, hand right there.
We can anticipate death.
We can anticipate death. Indeed. And that's a sobering thought that I think actually does condition a lot of the way that we think at certain times in our lives. There was a hand right there. Mm-hmm.
Emotions.
Emotions, absolutely. So those of us who are pet owners are pretty sure we see a lot of emotions in our pets, but I do think that there are probably emotions that are very unique to humans. There's a hand here, and then I'll get 3 in the front, and then I should keep going.
Well, what other species even bothers to reflect on their origin?
That's a great one. What other species bothers to reflect on their origin? None that are around today, but I'll talk about how maybe we have not been the only human species to do that. Mm-hmm.
Humans are visible. Humans are what? Visible. We can laugh.
Oh, humans are risible. We can laugh. Yes, absolutely. That's a great one.
Complex language.
Complex language. That is a classic example of one of the things that separates us, that makes us unique, and that really infuses pretty much everything that we do as humans. Advanced level of communication. So I'm working on that. Hopefully I'm doing that right now. So looks like I'll go on to the next slide. So as I mentioned, there'll be a place on our website. So we have a place you can already enter the answer, your answer to the question, what does it mean to be human? You'll have a bit more room on the sticky notes because we limit this to 140 characters. But I also wanted to mention, I'll just advertise our website a bit. It's humanorigins.si.edu. We have extensive content on the science of human origins, much of what you'll see in the traveling exhibit here. We have wonderful 3D scans of all of the objects in our exhibit, all of the casts of fossils and all of the artifacts. We also have resources developed by our broader social impacts committee. And that's a committee that Jim and Connie, who are here with us today, are the co-chairs of. And it's a committee of individuals from around the country that bring different faith and philosophical and educational perspectives about the intersection of scientific understandings of our origin and other societal understandings of our origin. It's a wonderful committee that is doing a variety of things, helping us develop resources to discuss the topic, helping us put on public programs, and also involved in this traveling exhibit. So what I'll do tonight is I want to explore 3 dimensions of our humanity that some, I think, complement the ideas that you've already mentioned, some of them. So I'll kind of present 3 short vignettes about how we can actually see scientific evidence for some things that may be a bit surprising. So oftentimes we dig up fossils as paleoanthropologists and we can say, I think I know what species this is, I may know how big this individual was, I may know what it ate, but how do we see the roots of things like sharing in the archaeological record? How do we see the roots of our parenting and how we take care of our babies? And how do we see the roots of things about technological innovation and social networking? So I'm going to get into some of that with you today. So I always start in the ground as an archaeologist or paleoanthropologist, and this is a Smithsonian research site that I've been involved with for nearly a decade now. It's called Alorga-Sile, and it's a local Maasai name. It's in the Rift Valley of East Africa, and it's specifically in southern Kenya. And it has this beautiful eroded landscape. We're thrilled pretty much every year when we go to do our excavations and find out that nature has already uncovered a lot of fossils and artifacts for us. It's a little hard to see, but right up there is kind of our tent city that we set up every summer when we go to do our excavations. And it's a real home away from home. It's one of the most beautiful places I have ever been. So we start with these places of natural erosion, and then we dig. We look for fossils and artifacts on the surface. This on the left is an excavation of a site where a giant extinct elephant was butchered about 1 million years ago. I've spent quite a bit of time analyzing the fossils from this site. I have about 100,000 fossils in my database, and I'm not done, sadly.
Wow.
But it's very exciting to actually see evidence of marks from stone knives on the fossils of these elephant bones. So those are smoking guns that let me know that 1 million years ago, ancient humans that were not quite like us were eating meat from these large animals. And this excavation has been going on for at least 20 years because we keep extending it and finding more things. On the right-hand side is a more recent excavation that I have not been involved with, but Rick Potts and his team have. And it's a new place a little bit further south, excuse me, from Alorga-Sile. And it's a really interesting geological context where there seems to be fissures in the ground where fossils are kind of falling into, and they're beautifully preserved. I've seen some of the fossils in the museum in Kenya. So figuring out kind of how this happened is one of the big mysteries that the team is trying to solve. And from this site, they have found the largest fossil lion that has ever been known. It's about 40% larger than the largest modern lion skull in the whole National Museums of Kenya. And just finding a lot of beautifully preserved carnivores, which is quite interesting. So paleoanthropology is an incredibly international endeavor. So on the top here is a picture of our field team at Alorga-Sile from probably 2005 or 2006, I think. We have a number of students that are with us. We have researchers from the US, from China, from Australia, from Canada, from different places across the world. And science is a language that we use to talk to each other and communicate with each other. Down here is a picture from a site that I worked at in Indonesia. I found out that the wonderful keep the sun off your eyes hats in Indonesia were fantastic. We're all looking slightly grumpy because every day in the middle of the afternoon we got poured on in the excavation. And the pits would fill up and we would have to come back the next day and everything would be dried out and fill them up again. So don't let anybody tell you that May is the end of the rainy season in Indonesia, because it's not. But it was really wonderful working with also the Indonesian students, the Indonesian colleagues, and as we do in Kenya, hiring local members of the local community to excavate with us. And that's a real cultural exchange that I think is really valuable. So we dig up all of these fossils and artifacts, and they don't all go into, this is Rick's picture of Rick's office. They don't all go into his office. But this gives you a sense of just the objects that we have on display in the permanent exhibit at the Natural History Museum in DC. And so the reason that this photo came about is because when Rick was away from his office for a little while, I think potentially maybe in the field, a good colleague of his who's a photographer came into his office. I hate to say this in the library, but took all the books off his shelves and beautifully arranged the fossil replicas and artifacts, some of which are original artifacts from our Smithsonian collections. His books have never quite gotten back to the same place since. But it's a really delightful picture and gives you a sense of just a smattering of all the evidence that we have for human prehistory. So there are more than 6,000 individuals of early humans that are known from the fossil record. There are hundreds of thousands of stone tools and other cultural and archaeological artifacts. There are things like this unassuming looking rock with the red coloring on it is probably the world's oldest artist palette. So red pigment was ground into this rock and was probably used for coloring. And we also have artistic carvings of people, of animals, and so really all the way from the earliest technology through the most amazing flourishing of artistic expression. Another thing about human evolution is it is a science that we can barely keep up with all the exciting new discoveries. Last year there was a new species of early human called a Homo naledi that was announced, was found deep in a cave in South Africa. The excavators had to really endure pretty perilous conditions to go into this dark cave with no natural light. The fossils had been found by cavers who thought they might have just been modern human bones. But it turns out there's 15 individuals of this new species down there, ranging from very young children all the way up to older adults. And there's no other fossils in the cave except Homo naledi. So it's a big mystery of how they got there. The cave seems to have been in the same configuration at the time that they were deposited. We don't have a date on them yet. Don't quite know how old they are. The team is working on that. But it's very exciting because it's finds like this that really help us redefine the narrative of human evolution. Another real area of growth, probably the biggest growth industry in paleoanthropology, is with ancient DNA. And it was in 2010 that a draft of the Neanderthal genome was published. And it just blew all of us away that you can actually get ancient DNA from fossils that are tens of thousands of years old. And in fact, there has been DNA retrieved from 400,000-year-old Neanderthal fossils in Spain. You have to get certain preservation conditions to get DNA that comes out of fossils, so usually in very cold and dry environments, little fragments of DNA can still persist. So now more than a dozen Neanderthals have had DNA extracted, and we can get a sense of things like how closely they were related to each other, and what kind of diseases did they have, and what did they look like, and what parts of their DNA are in us. And actually all modern humans who are not descended from Africa, where Neanderthals never lived, on average we have somewhere between about 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in us. So that's pretty exciting. For a long time, paleoanthropologists thought there was no interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals based on fossils, but it turns out based on DNA there was a bit of interbreeding at a few different times. So how do we know how old all these things are? I throw around things like thousands of years ago and millions of years ago. So geological dating is incredibly important, and fieldwork is the real key to this. And so this is a section of one of the hillsides at Alorgesailie, and based on very precise dating, particularly here of volcanic tuffs, we know that the bottom of this hillside goes back to about 670,000 years ago, and the top is about 633,000 years old. So along with the excavations to recover the fossils and the artifacts, we have a wonderful team of geologists who are helping us figure out how old the sediments are that the fossils and artifacts are found in, what kind of sediments they were buried in, were there rivers nearby, were there lakes nearby, was it a dry time, was it a wet time, so to really help us flesh out the scene and the picture of the fossil sites that seem so dry and dusty and nothing exciting going on today, but they were teeming with life in the past, and it's really fun to be able to find that. And I should mention that we use a few different techniques in our excavations, but there are more than a dozen different dating techniques. And one of the most important things that we do as paleoanthropologists is use multiple dating techniques to try to cross-check and refine the ages of the fossils and artifacts that we're finding. So the idea of change over time and the idea of evolution, particularly and the relationship between evolution and climate change has occurred over the last 7 million years. So that's the time of the split between the evolutionary branch that led to our species, to Homo sapiens, and the evolutionary branch that led to chimpanzees, who are our closest living relatives. So there's been actually quite a bit of change in climates in the past over this time. There were initially, in the early days of paleoanthropology, there were ideas that the Earth has always been stable and unchanging, and it was very particular environments like the savannas of Africa that drove human evolution, maybe the ice ages of Europe. But the more we learn about past climates, the more we learn that it was really probably instability and unpredictability of climate itself that seems to have been a driver of human evolution and human innovation. And so really, this is one of the most dramatic periods of climate change in our Earth's history. Changing between things like very wet times and very dry times, cold times and warm times. And it makes sense that as these conditions of life changed, that adaptations came about. Not only in human evolution, but particularly our lineage seems to have been pretty good at adapting to this instability. So the adaptations that came about sometimes were advantageous in these new conditions and sometimes were not. So I'll give you a little bit of a quick sense of the timeline of when different adaptations emerged in our evolutionary history. So I always think from the bottom up, thinking about doing my excavations. So starting about 6 million years ago, we have good evidence for walking upright on 2 legs. Every member of our family tree, all these different extinct species, all walked upright on 2 legs. That's one of the key characteristics. By 4 million years ago, there was an increase in the kinds of foods that our ancestors were eating. By about 2.5 million years ago, back to actually more than 3 million years ago now, people were making simple tools out of stone. By 2 million years ago, they were carrying those stones and carrying that food to different places on the landscape. Starting about 2 million years ago, our ancestors had longer legs, so that was one of the bigger kind of body size and shape changes. And then by about 1.7 million years ago, there was a big innovation in stone tool technology, going from very simple flaking to making what are called hand axes. So this simple stone flaking worked really well for about 1.5 million years ago. This Acheulean technology let people take many more stone knives off from the same amount of stone, of raw material. And that lasted another 1 million years. And then just in the last 1 million years has been the period of the most rapid increase in brain size that we have seen in our evolutionary history. So in general, body size and brain size tracked each other as our ancestors went from being about 3.5 feet tall to being as tall as we are, not me, but as tall as some of us are today. I'm not on the tall side. But about 1 million years ago, that brain size increase began to outpace body size increase. Starting about 800,000 years ago, now back to about 1 million years ago, we see evidence for the controlled use of fire, for cooking, probably for keeping warm. 400,000 years ago, we see evidence of the first shelters, so we're really thinking about coming together in, homes, basically. By 250,000 years ago, people are exchanging resources, long-distance trade, over a magnitude of area that had not been seen before. And around this time, we also see some of the first evidence for symbolic behavior, for art, for other kind of representational cultural behavior. And then it's really in the past 100,000 years ago that we see an increase in cultural diversity and a real ramping up of technological innovation. So our species is only really towards the top. Homo sapiens, that's all of us, evolved about 200,000 years ago. So all of these innovations occurred over the evolutionary history of our ancestors who are no longer with us. So with that background, I'm going to talk about the three vignettes and the three stories that I told you I would tell. So the first one we're going to start with is sharing and caring. So it's with the primates that we are connected to the tree of life. And this is a beautiful photo of Jane Goodall, the famous primatologist, reaching out her hand to one of her chimpanzee friends that she studied for so long. And so the basic idea of studying primates to understand human evolution is the kinship of all organisms, but particularly that they are the closest related living organisms to people. And so another thing that we see that's similar in chimpanzees, these chimpanzees in West Africa are cracking nuts. It takes chimpanzees, the young ones, about 2 or 3 years to actually learn how to crack nuts well. So we can see that in some of our own kids. Sometimes it takes them quite a while to learn how to do some things well. And so the idea of kinship and connectedness is something that a lot of us as scientists embrace, but this kinship with other living things can be troubling to people. So that is something that we stay aware of. So one of the most interesting things about sharing, and it's a part of my own research, has to do with food. So we do something really weird when we go into grocery stores for an animal. We don't eat the food right away, except maybe when me or my 5-year-old are really hungry. We don't tend to sit down on the floor and start opening the packages. So not only do we not eat it right away, we bring it to share with other people. Birds and other mammals will provision their young, but we share food with unrelated adults, and we share food with strangers, with people we don't even know. And that's a pretty odd thing to do as an animal. So when did this sharing food with people that we don't know, or maybe people in an extended social group, come about in prehistory? So another Smithsonian research site that I've studied some of the fossils from, called Kengera South in Western Kenya, can shed some light on this. And it turns out that at Kengera South, there's an early stone toolkit, those simple hammer stones to break open bones, and simple stone knives to be able to cut meat off of animals. This simple technology opens up a world of new foods. So with a stone, you can basically crush something more effectively than an elephant's molar. And with a sharp flake, you can cut something more efficiently than the lion's sharp teeth. So all of these resources in the African ecosystem were opened up to early humans who started using these simple stone tools. We also see a change at this time to a diet more rich in meat and tubers, so plants that grow underground, things that today we think of like carrots and potatoes. So we see the processing of these tubers even going back 2 million years ago. And we also see the earliest long distance, or longer distance, transporting of food and stones back to a single place over and over again. So this was a place on the landscape that early humans, probably the species Homo erectus, given the time period at 2 million years ago, were bringing tools and bringing food. So we think this is the beginning of really starting to share with other members of their social group. So this early stone toolkit, as I mentioned, it's a simple technology. You take a stone that kind of has some good angles. You take a round stone called a hammer stone, and you use the hammer stone, you smack it against a core, and these sharp flakes come off. And it's the sharp flakes that are the tools most of the time. And as I mentioned, it seems simple, but it was really revolutionary. This technology allowed the earliest humans to spread out of Africa. The earliest humans that left Africa is probably the species Homo erectus. And so going from East Africa, we see some of the earliest evidence of early humans outside of Africa at a site called Dmanisi in the Republic of Georgia, which I'll mention in a bit. But really going all the way to Eastern Africa, where there have been some Smithsonian research. Rick Potts has directed excavations and been involved with projects in the Nihuan Basin and in Yuanmo in China. And I've done some work a little bit near Sanjiran in Indonesia. So it's really this sharing food and making simple tools that seems to have facilitated this first movement and migration out of Africa. So Dmanisi, which I just mentioned, there have been 5 fairly complete early human skulls found from Dmanisi. This site in the Republic of Georgia dated back to about 1.8 million years old. So what do you notice about this skull? Looks unusual. Large cranium, toothless. So he has no teeth. So he's nicknamed the old man from Dmanisi because not only does his skull have no teeth left in them, it's not because they fell out after his skull was fossilized, it's because based on the amount of resorption of the bone in the upper part of the jaw and the lower part of the jaw, his teeth probably fell out 8 years before he died. So his social group provisioned him for years. They potentially had to process food for him that he could eat. So this may be an echo of the kind of empathy and social care that we see today that goes back almost 2 million years. So, this may have been the beginning of a sense of responsibility to others in our social group. A little bit later in time, this is the skull and the 2 upper arm bones from a Neanderthal from a site called Shanidar Cave in Iraq, dated back to about 65,000 years ago. One side of his head, his left side, he had some kind of an injury to the left side of his head when he was quite young, and it caused the right side of his body, which is controlled by the left side of your brain, to basically be completely withered and not really function. So this is the left side, this is his left upper arm, that's his right upper arm. So the bone is just really malformed. So it's estimated that this blow to his head happened sometime when he was maybe 8 or 10 years old, and he lived to 35. So this was another individual that people were absolutely taking care of. He couldn't forage for himself, he couldn't hunt for himself. So this gives you a sense that this is something that is persistent in a sense in our evolutionary history. So now we'll talk about brains, babies, and parenting. So one important thing that I always think about evolution is that we always think of evolution as progressive. It's not. So adaptations that occur often come with costs or disadvantages. So the first one I'll talk about are huge brains. We have enormous brains. They take up 2% of our body weight and 20% of our resting energy, which is not a good deal as an organ. Very energetically expensive. But they store decades of information, and they can input and output in split seconds. They're amazing organs of flexibility. But I mentioned they gobble up a lot of energy. Our newborns are born with pretty spectacularly big heads, which can be difficult for the half of us that are giving birth to those newborns with spectacularly big heads. And so there's some calculation that on average, the circumference of newborn heads are 102% the size of the average female pelvic inlet. And that's not math that I really like. So this causes a real constraint because in order to birth newborns with really big brains, females' hips need to be shaped in a certain way, but we also need to walk efficiently bipedally. So there is a really big disadvantage of having a big brain. And growing up slowly has its dangers, and I will mention that in a little bit as well. Having very helpless and dependent offspring for quite a long time. So talking, what I am doing now, that seems to be a pretty big advantage. There were 2 answers that had to do with communication and language and really being able to understand what each other is thinking and meaning. So our voice boxes drop low in our throats about maybe 2 years of age. That's when you really start to hear kids talking in words that we understand. That enables us to produce a huge variety of sounds and is the basis for the sophisticated communication that we have. We can communicate about the past and the present and the future, and really is something that's very unique about humans. So this seems to be a massive benefit. But for adults, not for babies who are nursing, but for adults, it is impossible for us to swallow and breathe at the same time. This means that we are the only animal that can choke to death on our own food. So we can choke from food that is stuck in our windpipe. That seems to be a really huge disadvantage. But there must have been enough of an advantage to being able to communicate the way that we do, that kind of morphology, that kind of size and shape and makeup of our throats was selected for. So I had to put pictures of my son in here. But the point of these pictures is that babies are fat. And we all began as babies. Babies, the kind of fat that babies have, they're dominated by something called brown fat. And that brown fat has a lot of mitochondria in it, producing energy. So our brains take up 2% of our body weight and 20% of our resting energy. Babies' brains take up 65% of their resting energy. So an incredible amount of all the energy that babies are taking in, not necessarily from eating or drinking from paper cups, really goes to growing their brain. And so having a big brain has to have been a huge advantage for this kind of selection to take place. So we take an incredibly long time to grow up. This is a really wonderful photo illustrating that for humans, for most cultures, it's not only parents that take care of their offspring. It's aunts and sisters and grandparents and people who are even unrelated to children are the ones that help them grow up. And so being cared for compensates for essentially the dependence of our offspring. So this caring is crucial, and we've talked about when that may have occurred. But when did this really slow growth and having such dependent offspring for a long time occur? So, growing up human compared to other primates, we grow up in the slow lane, which I didn't hit on the New Jersey Turnpike. I'm just so excited about that. So we have these enormous brains that takes us a long time to grow up. We have these very unique phases of childhood. We have infancy. We have infancy. We have this long childhood, which is not seen in other primates or other animals. We have adolescence, which my colleague Connie has 2 kids in adolescence right now, and I know that's a trying time. One thing that's very unique about humans is having grandparents. Whoever decided old age started at 50, we have problems with that. But it's basically having a lifespan beyond reproductive years is unique to humans. There was a really interesting study that was done recently that humans have this unique genetic variant in a gene called CD33. And this variant enhances mental ability, or basically prevents mental decline in older individuals. It is unique to humans, and when things go wrong with that gene, that is sometimes where Alzheimer's or dementia happens. But this gene, the mutation of this gene that's unique to humans may be one indication that there has been selection for being able to, for having grandparents that have longevity, that can teach children and grandchildren about the world and about growing up in their unique cultures. So when did this happen? It turns out that dentists were the first to figure this out. I love those pictures of kids in their baby teeth. And so it turns out that all of us in our tooth enamel basically have a record of every day of our lives. So there's a very thin layer of tooth enamel that's laid down in your teeth every single day in a 24-hour cycle. So you can actually count the number of days that it took a tooth to form and erupt. And so you can, from the time that from the time of birth to when, or from the time of when a tooth was formed to when that tooth is finished forming and erupts. And so, let's go here. So we basically have this internal timekeeper, one growth line each day, and the most traumatic thing that any of us will likely ever go through is our own birth. And so it is so traumatic physically that growth of the teeth stop for a day during birth. And so there's something called a birth line. It's like your biological birth certificate. And so right in your teeth, you can see that cessation of growth during on the day of birth. So you can actually count the number of days since the day of birth when the tooth was formed. And we can not only do this with modern humans, this actually happens to be a section of tooth from a 20 million year old fossil ape called proconsul. So this is something we can see in the past, how long it took other species to grow up. So if we look at the species that we are most closely related to among the primates, humans, it takes about 6-ish years for our first molars to erupt. They're sometimes called your 6-year molars. Gorillas and chimpanzees, their first molars erupt quite a bit faster. They grow up faster than we do. So we can look at fossils, and we can see that starting from older at the top and going to younger at the bottom, that some of the earliest members of our family tree, the Australopithecines, Australopithecus afarensis, that's a species that Lucy belonged to, if you've heard of that fossil. Australopithecus africanus, we're getting a little bit of a slowdown, potentially from probably what was the ancestral ape condition of growing up quickly. Once you get to Homo erectus, which is that first species that left Africa, now we're at about 4.5 years, the age of that first molar erupting, so their life trajectory is starting to slow down. Neanderthals, interestingly, these are our closest extinct relatives, their first molar actually erupts a little bit later than ours, so they seem to have almost maybe gone to an extreme of growing up quite slowly. So, excuse me. So what else do we have for evidence of things like families and social lives? Well, we have the earliest evidence for fire. This is one of the earliest sites dating back to almost 800,000 years ago. This is a site called Gesher Benat Yaakov in Israel, and there are multiple layers of burnt artifacts and burnt seeds and burnt bones, and we know that people were going back to this place to cook food starting at about 800,000 years ago. So really the combination of an increase in brain size starting around that time, seeing the earliest evidence for fire. We also see the earliest evidence for shelters going back about 400,000 years ago. And this all really makes sense as that pace of growth was slowed down and there was more need for social cohesion and staying together and spending a longer time taking care of our children as they grew up. So the last story I will tell, scientific story I will tell, is about innovations in social networking. And so this comes from Smithsonian research, particularly of brick pots, and some of the work that we've been doing back at Alurgis Island. And so there are excavations that have been done in sites that are part of the slightly higher levels of sediments at Alurgis Island, dating from about 400,000 years ago all the way up to about 50,000 years ago. This is the time of the origin of our species. This is the time that we see some of the earliest, more sophisticated innovations happen. And so what we see here is a big shift. After about 500,000 years ago, there's layers and layers and layers and layers of hand axes. I think this site has the highest number of hand axes literally anywhere in the world. And so this hand axe technology, even at Alurgis Island, persisted for more than 500,000 years. Then there is a gap in the prehistoric record. We don't have sediments between about 500,000 years and 320,000 years ago. And there's a totally different technology. And so there's a technology that is focused on smaller artifacts, artifacts for more specific purposes, artifacts made of stones that are brought from many kilometers away. So people are going further to get stones with specific qualities to make these artifacts. And what they're doing is preparing rocks to make projectile points. So in the evolution of hunting technology, first there were spears that you thrust into animals. Then you could take a step back and there were spears that you threw into animals. And then when projectile points were created, it allows you to get a safe distance from really dangerous animals. And so once you have these things that fly through the air, the earth has never really been the same since. We also have the earliest pigments. I will say this research is not published yet. I'm happy to share it with you, but look for it in the next several months. So the team is working on writing a series of papers about this right now. And looking at the origins of innovation, we see things like processing pigments, treatment of the dead, the earliest burials, with ritual and symbolic behavior going back 100,000 years ago. We see long-distance trade of tens and really hundreds of kilometers, almost going back about 120,000 years ago. Starting to expand the diet, eating things like shellfish, goes back to about 140,000 years ago. The evidence for fishing, for mining, for the beginning of evidence for notation. There's a really interesting artifact dated to about 77,000 years ago from a site in South Africa that has definitely very patterned marks in it. You don't know if it has to do with keeping track of time or keeping track of something. The earliest beads and then the earliest images and the flourishing of art. So all of this happens around the time of the oldest known fossils of our species, the oldest Homo sapiens. So we see increasing innovation, tools made for very specific purposes. We see wider social networks, the evidence for trade. At Alorga-Siley, we see the evidence for trading stones up to 100 kilometers away. We don't think it was groups going 100 kilometers to get the stone, and we think that we see big chunks of stone coming into these sites. So it's not people going somewhere, chipping the stones along the way and getting a tiny little bit in the excavations. We see big chunks of stone. So this is really the origin of trade. Also, the evolution of complex symbolic activity. It is very hard to find evidence for language. Words do not fossilize. They may preserve in your mind for a long time, but they don't fossilize. And so we think that we can link the beginning of symbolic activity and symbolic representation potentially to the origin of language. And really thinking about complex thinking and planning. It is incredibly difficult to make some of the artifacts that were made tens of thousands of years ago. And there has to be a real mental map of how that artifact will be made. There has to be a mental map of where to go to get the particular stones that these early humans were looking for. So this all is evidence for a greater capacity to adjust to and alter our surroundings. So the Anthropocene was mentioned in the introduction, and humans have absolutely become an amazing force on Earth. And we can potentially see the traces of that back tens and tens of thousands of years ago. And the research coming out of the Smithsonian at Alorga-Siley is probably going to push some of these dates back quite a bit. So I'll mention a little bit again about that pigment. And so there is a rock with ochre, so red pigment that has been rubbed on it. So this is Rick, one of our colleagues from George Washington University, Allison Brooks, colleague from the National Science Foundation, John Yellen. It was the excavations that they were directing in which this amazing object was found. And so this pigment, we don't know what it was used for. There are not caves in the area that are decorated. People may have been decorating their skin or decorating other objects. But eventually, people were decorating all kinds of things. And it's this beginning that led to all kinds of carving. This is a really wonderful figurine called the Lion Man with the head of a lion and the body of a person, of a human. We start to see this really abstract and representational art. This is the earliest crayon. And so this is a big piece of pigment from a site in Zambia that has facets worn into it. We know it was used for coloring. We know it probably didn't fit into a box of 64, but we do know that 250,000 years ago, people were coloring with this kind of color. We have the earliest burials that I mentioned with ritual. So this one, that earliest burials go back about 100,000 years ago. This is a representation of a double child burial from Russia that dates back a few tens of thousands of years ago, but these children were buried with thousands of stone beads, probably on some kind of clothing that has since disintegrated. This is one of my favorite things that we have in 3D in our exhibit. It's a representation, excuse me, of one of the paintings from Chauvet Cave in France, dated to about 30,000 years ago. And so when researchers first went into this cave and found these beautiful paintings, they were trying to figure out, why does it seem like there's overprinting of the bison, of the rhinos, of the lions? So are they practicing? Is it people coming in at different times? So the local officials heard about this discovery, and the archaeologists decided that they were going to put on a Stone Age show for the local officials. And so, one second. So they brought torches, real torches with flickering firelight into the cave. In front of the flickering firelight, they move. So it is the origin of animation. And there have been artistic techniques found in the Paleolithic thousands of years ago that people thought were invented in the Renaissance. So it's amazing finding the origin and the whispers of the things that we consider so uniquely human today, dating back so long ago in the prehistoric record. Excuse me. And they really speak to being able to represent things not only in our surroundings, but things in our minds, and really the root of imagination. So I've told you a little bit about the discoveries of archaeological artifacts, of fossils, of DNA, of other things we can trace in our past, and they highlight some of the most amazing findings that paleoanthropologists have made. You and I, all of us here, are part of an immense genealogy. This is, excuse me, a depiction of our family tree, and it is a tree of kinship. It's not a straight line, but it's a diverse and branching tree, really like that of all other organisms. This is from 6 million years ago, from the past up to the present, up to today. You will notice that there is only one bubble crossing today. And so all of these other species, all of these other ways of life are now extinct. And I think there's something kind of humbling thinking about the fragility of life, thinking about our ancestors that are no longer here. And we have such diversity of people living today, which is beautiful and wonderful. But I think one of the messages that we can bring as scientists that study the deep past is that this diversity has a very deep root in unity. And that the differences that we see so obviously among us today, in the sense of time, the scale over which these differences have evolved really pale in comparison to the scale of unity that we all share. So I think that's something kind of profound to think about our shared heritage. So in closing, I hope I've interested you in some of the main themes of the exhibit. You can explore more about all of this right down the hall in Exploring Human Origins, What Does It Mean to Be Human? And I will say, the final thing, is that researchers have made discoveries about the origin of our species, about the origin of behaviors, about the deep roots of our family tree. But the way that people use the word human is really much broader than necessarily what research on human evolution can study. So this exhibit and the programs about exploring human origins is really an invitation and what I hope is an opportunity to ponder how our lives and the things that we care about and the scientific findings on human origins can meet and become acquainted with one another. Thank you. So I'm very happy to answer questions.
Yeah.
There's another mic will come around. It's coming out right now.
Since all of us are from Homo sapiens,
Yes.
currently, who knows what may come after that, but let's stay with what we have. How do you account for the Pygmies being short, the Watusis being tall, and the Scandinavians being blonde-eyed and blue-haired?
So the question was really, how do we account for diversity in modern people? There's a couple of different things. Some of the diversity in modern people is based on natural selection. So in areas where there is less food, oftentimes people evolve a smaller stature. A lot of the change we see in people becoming very tall is more of a recent nutritional kind of change rather than an evolutionary change. An interesting thing about kind of the Scandinavians being blue-eyed, there's evidence that every single person with blue eyes on the planet is descended from one individual who had a mutation that caused blue eyes about 7,000 years ago. So why are blue eyes persistent in some populations? So there's also not only natural selection, but sexual selection. And so it's possible that some of the traits that we have are due to mating preferences. Some of them are also due to what's called genetic drift. So when small populations move into new areas, some of their genetic makeup is simply due to chance. That a couple of these people may have had, a whole complex, so height is a whole complex of genes, but they may have had genes for having shorter or taller stature. And if those genes basically become prevalent, that's how some of those changes take place. So it can be a variety of things. Oh, do they know where that person lived? I don't. It was presumably somewhere in Europe, but I'm not entirely sure.
Excuse me. Do we know why life started in Africa, South?
So the question is, do we know why life started in Africa? I will say the answer to that is because that's where the earlier forms that we evolved from were. And so we evolved from earlier apes. And actually in Africa and across Europe and even parts of Asia, in the Miocene, which is which spans from about 5 million years ago back to almost 20 million years ago, there were a whole variety of fossil apes really in tropical areas that persisted all across Europe. It's crazy to think of Europe having tropical forests, but it did many million years ago. And so it was a combination of the right kinds of environments for those ancestors to live in. And when environments changed, there may have been selection pressure for eating new kinds of food or new kinds of locomotion, walking around on two legs. But evolution always acts on raw material. And so the raw material that was there was, in a sense, our ape ancestors. And so there was a whole variety of apes that were living in Africa before about 6 million years ago. I can just repeat the question.
Yeah.
How is it determined if a fossil or something is found in Kenya? What's determined what ends up in Rick Potts' office or what stays in Kenya?
So that's a good question. So for fossils that are, for example, found in Kenya, how does it determine what ends up in Rick Potts' office? Nothing ends up in Rick Potts' office of original fossils. No, it's a good question. And so what we have on display in 3D in our exhibit, which you can see in 2D here, although I will say there's some beautiful skull replicas that you can turn around and they can look and talk to each other. So there are international regulations that fossils stay in their country of origin. Same thing with artifacts. There can be exceptions of export for very specialized technology and tests and things that can't be done in the home countries. So I've been working in Kenya for about 20 years, and I have seen that now there are CT scanners in Kenya in hospitals that people can bring fossils to do very sophisticated CT scanning. There are other kinds of investigations that couldn't have been done 20 years ago. So that's really the only reason why fossils are sometimes exported and usually just for temporary purposes.
Right there. Okay. This might be a silly question, but in the news, there was this bear by the name of Petals. Probably all have read it. And unfortunately, it had injured its front paws, and it was walking straight up. If Petals was a female, I don't know whether it's male or female, if it was a female and it had offspring, would that offspring mimic the mother?
That's a great question. So I have not heard of this bear, but it's apparently a bear that hurt its front paws.
Right. Only walked upright.
Only walked upright. So, and if it had offspring, if it was female, would that offspring mimic the mother? So, all bears presumably have the capacity to do that, but if there's not if there's not an injury, if there's not a very strong kind of behavioral reason to, bears are better at walking on 4 legs than they are walking on 2. It's possible that her offspring could potentially try to mimic her, but that's not the kind of thing that would be kind of a genetic predisposition to walking upright simply because the mother was walking upright. I hope that answers the question clearly. Question there.
As far as variation in people from different parts of the world, how does that relate to like ancient predecessors? As far as, is this unique to our species that we have, people from Asia are a certain way and so on and so forth? Did that come after humans evolved, or do we always have that much variation within these ancient humans?
That's a great question. So the amazing variation that we see in people across the world today, is that something that was always inherent in ancient humans, or is it something that happened after our species evolved? Those differences are very recent. And so when modern humans evolved in Africa about 200,000 years ago, I'm still not rebooting. So it's really been quite a ways since then that we see the evolution of some of the features that we can see in specific geographic groups. Part of that is because modern humans did not leave Africa until about 100,000 years ago. And in fact, there was a failed attempt to leave Africa by modern humans about 100,000 years ago. So there are skeletons in the Middle East of modern humans of Homo sapiens at 100,000 years ago. But it looks like that population did not persist. So from genetic evidence, we can tell that really the first main wave of modern humans that left Africa and populated the rest of the world left somewhere between 80 and 60,000 years ago. People didn't reach Australia until about 40,000 years ago. Europe about 45,000 years ago. North America somewhere around 15,000 years ago. So some of these differences have only been evolving since that time. So a relatively short time span. Question there?
How extensive is the genomic history of the predecessor species?
So how extensive is the genomic history of the predecessor of our predecessor species? Well, Neanderthals have the best studied DNA of any ancient human. As I mentioned, more than a dozen Neanderthal fossils have had samples from DNA. You never get a full sequence from a fossil. You get bits and pieces that you then amplify and replicate and kind of put the pieces back together. There's also a group of early humans called the Denisovans, and they're from a cave in Siberia called Denisova Cave. This really interesting population is pretty much only known from a tooth and a pinky bone fragment. And the only reason that it was discovered to be something that's different than Neanderthals is because the pinky bone fossil was found in a cave with other Neanderthal fossils. And it was being sequenced along with the Neanderthals as part of the Neanderthal Genome Project, and researchers went, this is not a Neanderthal, this is not a modern human, and it's just as different from Neanderthals as we are. And so they don't have a species name yet, but they're called Denisovans because they're from Denisova Cave. So we have DNA from modern humans in the fossil record, from Neanderthals, from Denisovans. The most ancient DNA that has been extracted from our ancestors is from 400,000-year-old Neanderthals. The most ancient DNA that has been extracted from anywhere is from 700,000-year-old horse fossils in Europe. So far, modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. Hopefully, at some point, we'll have more. I see it. Let me get a hand back there.
Did we lose our hair because we were semi-aquatic at some point?
So the question, did we lose our hair because we were semi-aquatic? Not likely. So I know there's this aquatic ape hypothesis. But really probably the best explanation of why we are hairless compared to other apes is that there was strong selection. So being hairless, we are very effective sweaters. We don't have sweaters, we are effective at sweating. That's what I mean. And so being hairless really helps dissipate heat. And so once early humans, probably Homo erectus, really started venturing out into very open and dry and hot environments, there was likely quite strong selection pressure for that heat dissipation. So brains being hot is a really bad thing in order for our functioning. And so it looks like, though, there's interesting evidence for when that happened. And so the evidence comes from the genetics of lice. And so you have two different species, not all of us hopefully right now, but there are two different species of lice that inhabit humans. There is the species that inhabits our head, there's head lice, and then there's what we will call body lice that inhabit other parts of our body. And it looks like those two species split about 1.7 million years ago. So probably at that time, body hair was patchy enough that those two species were not reproducing with each other. So that right is around the same time that we see the earliest spread of Homo erectus out of Africa, but also into drier environments across Asia. And so it may have something to do with that.
Apparently several of these species of man lived at the same time.
Yes.
And the fact that only Homo sapiens is left, has anyone done a study about the warlike nature of the Homo sapiens to get rid of the other people?
So good question. So there were several species that have lived at the same time in multiple times really across our evolutionary history. And has anyone studied the warlike nature of modern people? We're the only ones left. So what we don't see in the fossil record is we don't see any kind of evidence for widespread killing or wars between species. Modern humans and Neanderthals are probably the species that were most closely related to each other that lived at the same place in the same time for tens of thousands of years in Europe and in Asia. We don't see any kind of killing fields or evidence for major battles or anything like that. We know that modern humans and Neanderthals interacted because they interbred, but we don't see evidence for that. And so whether that's something that is innate to modern humans, whether it's not until sophisticated technology came about that there can be large-scale warfare is a question. But we don't see it deeper in our evolutionary history. We also have very small population sizes deeper in evolutionary history. So it's very likely that really increasing population is what in some senses leads to that conflict. People basically being in conflict over resources if there are more people than resources can support. Question?
Yes, with Pangea and the tectonic plate, why is it that everything still seems to be found primarily in Africa? And if you were to take South America and line it up with Africa, it's like two puzzle pieces that match. Why are they not in South Africa?
Yeah, so the question is with the Pangea, which was actually tens of millions of years before humans evolved, that you see a single continent on the planet. So you do see South America fitting next to Africa like a puzzle piece, but that was tens of millions and hundreds of millions of years before humans evolved. And so that's why there's great searches in South America for fossil primates, and we see really good exchange actually between continents, but that's much earlier than our family tree.
In the exhibit in the other room, there's a notation about Homo sapiens nearly becoming extinct, 60,000 to 100,000 years ago. What was the event or series of events?
So there's a question, there's a note in the exhibit that somewhere between 60 and 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens almost went extinct. And what was the event that caused that? The short answer is we don't know. But we do know, and that evidence is actually DNA. And so, as I've been mentioning, there is amazing outward diversity of modern humans, but we are incredibly genetically similar. And actually, two humans from any